Okay, so I'm here with Sy Garte. So, Sy, if you just want to take a moment to introduce yourself, maybe talk about your educational background, where you're from, any current projects you're working on.
Sure. My name is Sy Garte. I'm originally from New York, and I have a PhD in biochemistry. I was in academia as a professor for many decades. I spent some time at the NIH in an administrative capacity. And my projects, I have one book that called The Works of His Hands that was published 2 years ago.
Mhm.
And I'm working on a couple of others and some articles. I'm the editor in chief of a magazine called God and Nature, which is put out by the American Scientific Affiliation. So that keeps me pretty busy.
Awesome. So, Sy, I didn't know that you taught at Rutgers, or do you still teach there?
No, well, I do have an appointment there. I'm a visiting professor, but I don't
Oh,
teach.
oh, okay. Because
Yeah,
I graduated from Rutgers. I received my
I
undergrad.
saw that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, all right. Well, today we're going to basically just ask you a lot of questions.
Okay.
So let's just get into the first question here. How did science shake your atheism? Because there seems to be this pervasive notion that the more you study science, the smaller God becomes, and we could just throw God away. It's just kind of unnecessary. So how did science shake your atheism? Because I know you were an atheist before for quite a
Yeah.
while. Yeah.
Well, I was born into an atheist family, so I was always an atheist. I didn't lose Christian faith. I never had any faith of any kind. And I became a scientist. I studied science in college and then, of course, in graduate school. And while I was in college, I was a chemistry major and I was learning a little bit about quantum mechanics so that I could, solve problems. And later, I read some books about quantum theory, which, I hadn't really thought about the implications of it. But when I read some of these books and thought about it, it seemed kind of strange that, all of actual material reality is based on what's ultimately a truly random set of processes which occur in quantum mechanics when it looks at how protons and electrons and photons behave. It's nothing that we would consider in normal parlance, we would consider rational or reasonable. It's very, very strange. In fact, you can call it mystical.
Mm.
Now, that didn't lead me to faith. That didn't bring me to believe in God at all. But what it did do was shake my materialism quite a bit. And the atheism that I followed was highly materialistic. It also included a denial of any kind of spirituality or anything outside of the material natural world. That's what I inherited from my parents, who were
Mm.
quite militant in their atheism. Um, so that took a while. When I started learning biochemistry in detail, some of the advanced material that I learned in grad school, I was really overwhelmed by the complexity of some of the basic biochemical processes that go on in life. And again, that did not bring me to God, but what that did was make me wonder and ask several questions about, what's going on here. I mean, how did all this develop and happen, and why are we here? And I began looking. That opened the door for me to start looking into first just the idea of spirituality. So, I looked into Buddhism a little bit. I looked into various forms of mysticism, both religious and not. And it was a slow process where I, eventually, through other means, became interested in the question of God.
Mhm.
But it started with science, right?
Right. And I think it's important too that there's kind of this dogmatism that's around science. You can explain the entire natural world, maybe,
Right.
cosmology can explain the universe, the physical arrangements of the universe. But that doesn't answer the question if there is a God or not. That's committing a category error. So I think a lot of people get that
Right.
confused. They think God is a scientific
Yeah,
explanation, but
that's
it's not.
that's a really important point. I'm often asked, where's your proof of God, or where's your scientific evidence for God? And I
Mhm.
keep having to say, well, there's some scientific evidence, but it's not very strong. In other words, it's what we do. What in science we almost never say we've proved something. What we say is we have evidence for, or we say this result is consistent with the idea that such and such.
Yeah.
And there are some things in the natural world that are consistent with the idea of God. They're also consistent with other ideas. So,
Mhm.
you can't say this absolutely demonstrates or proves God through science.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think every scientist who's a Christian acknowledges that. And it's kind of foolish to try to do so, because then you're admitting that the only epistemology that's valid, the only way we can know anything is through science, and that's called scientism, and it's a fallacy.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. The scientism part. I had a conversation about scientism when we were, trying to refute that idea that science is the
Right.
only way to truth. So,
Exactly.
um, and plenty of scientists have believed in the existence of God. Bacon,
Oh,
Boyle, Newton. Yeah,
all the original scientists were
yeah, and even
theists
contemporaries.
or Christians, both. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, even contemporary scientists like yourself or someone like Francis Collins, who was head of
Right.
the Genome Project, right? I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
he
So,
was.
right. Okay. So, question two, Sai, when did you finally become a theist? Like, how long did this take?
Yeah, it took a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there was a long period when I kind of thought maybe I believe in God, but I'm not sure. I guess you would call that agnostic.
Yeah.
And that was a long period, at least a decade. And I was at that point. Somebody brought me to church, a friend of mine, which was the first time. I was in my 40s. It was the first time I'd ever been to any kind of a house of worship.
Oh, wow.
And I was very nervous about it, but it went fine, and I liked it. The priest, to my surprise, talked about love, which I didn't expect. I thought he was going to rail at us about being sinners and throw stones at me in particular.
Or hell.
But
Yeah.
but it was actually quite nice, and I went back a few times. This happened to be a Catholic church. And it was I had learned terrible things about Christianity and religion in general from my upbringing, and those things turned out not to be true. I found out. So that opened me up a little bit. I mean, I still couldn't believe, but I thought it was kind of nice. The music was nice, and the ideas were nice. So I was not as hostile as I had been. And I just decided to start reading the Gospels, which I had never done. And I found them, fascinating, interesting, surprising, especially the book of Acts. I found to be, it seemed to me like real historical discussion. I mean,
Yeah.
the way it was written, it didn't seem like somebody made that up.
Right.
And as an atheist, I had assumed that everything in the New Testament was made up from scratch. There was no truth to any of it.
Mhm.
Then I started wondering about that's kind of weird. I mean, if the book of Acts is history, then somebody was either really deluded or something happened.
Yeah.
Maybe they misinterpreted it, but something happened.
Right.
You got to get that far.
Absolutely.
So all of this was slowly making me think about, the whole idea of God. But I found it really, really hard to say I believe in this, because it just went against everything I had, grown up with, and it's
Right.
very hard to shake that stuff.
Yeah. So, Sai, did you kind of start out with maybe like a classical theistic picture and then went on to Christianity? Did you just go into Christianity? How did that work?
That's a good question, because I started thinking there might be a God. I wouldn't say I was a classical theist, but I had this agnostic phase where sometimes I even found myself praying to God, and without. Of course, a lot of atheists do that too. In certain cases, in certain circumstances, they might find themselves. But I found myself, occasionally thinking, yeah, this. But then I would go back and say, nah.
Yeah.
What actually happened was that I went straight to Christianity. I mean, I had been reading
It's
about
interesting.
Buddhism, Judaism, a little bit about Islam, just as interest, but nothing caught me. It was just intellectual interest. But
Right.
I had personal experiences with Jesus Christ, and once I came to faith, I realized that those actually started when I was 16,
Mm.
but I had been ignoring them for forever, for decades.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And those personal experiences were directly either Jesus Christ or the Holy Spirit. And uh, so I came to Christianity, without having a long period of believing in God, but not sure what God, etc., that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Could you talk about a personal experience or a dream that you've had? So there's more in the book that people, if they
Yeah,
go out and
yeah,
purchase Sy's book, you guys can talk. He talks about more of the dreams in there, but maybe if you could just give
right,
one.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can mention one of them. The book discusses, I think, two. There are actually three or four. One of
Hmm.
one of which is not in the book. Um, but I think the one that was most striking to me was the one about the cliff where I was hanging.
I
I
remember
dreamt that
that.
I was hanging with my hands onto a rock that was jutting out from a cliff. So I was over the cliff, but hanging onto this rock. And I'm terrified of heights, by the way,
Me too.
in real life. So that was a terrifying,
Yeah.
terrifying dream and a real nightmare. And then I heard a voice that said, "Just let go." I didn't know what that meant. And I said to myself, well, I said in the dream, I said, I can't let go, I'll fall. And the voice was insistent and said, "Just let go." And I figured I'm not going to be able to hold on much longer anyway. So I let go. And as I did, the the world turned 90 degrees. And instead of hanging from a cliff down, I was lying on the ground,
Wow.
holding onto a boulder.
Hmm.
And I looked up, and there was a man whose voice I had heard. And I woke up, I had no idea what that dream meant. And I was very disturbed by it. But it came to me later. I didn't really understand it at first.
Hmm.
But later, it came to me that what the voice was saying was, and this of course was Jesus, was saying was, let go of everything that's holding you back.
Hmm.
Let go of all your preconceived notions about reality, of the possibility of something spiritual or supernatural. Just let that go
Right.
and let go of all your fears and worries, nervousness. And, I couldn't do it at the time. I kind of put it out of my mind, and I had two or three more dreams.
Wow.
And eventually, one of which is in the book, which was much clearer. And then I had an experience, and I was still, yeah, it would be really nice if I could believe in Jesus Christ and the resurrection and
Hmm.
the kingdom of God and eternal life and all of that. It would be so nice, but I just can't do it. First, it's too good to be true, and
Hmm.
it just goes against rationality. I'd love to do it. And then I was driving in my car, and this is detail in the book.
Hmm.
Uh, and I had the radio on. I was alone, and I heard a Christian preacher. And this, like many preachers, this guy was fantastic. I mean, I didn't hear what he was saying, but his voice, his
Yeah.
entire delivery was really well done, and I kind of like that. I admire that just as an art form.
Hmm.
And so I turned off the radio because I wasn't really listening, and I said to myself, well, what if I preached a sermon? What would I talk about? And I thought I would probably talk about something like the origin of life, or something about quantum mechanics or something like that,
Right.
something I knew about. And the next thing I knew, I actually pulled over at some point because I realized this is getting too intense. But what happened was I began imagining that I was preaching in front of a group of listeners who, were all Christians. So it's like a tent revival kind of thing, which I'd seen pictures of.
Right, right.
And I started preaching, and the words didn't come from me. I was listening myself also.
Wow.
I don't think I spoke out loud. I'm pretty sure it was all in my mind, but I heard the words, and I later wrote them down. And in fact, that's what's in the book, is the sermon. But it was so powerful. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, for the very first time, I read that sermon aloud on a podcast with Jim Stump at BioLogos.
Okay.
And I had never been able to read it aloud before. I always got too emotional. And this one I managed to get through to the last couple of words. And so
wow, that's amazing. That's amazing stuff.
If you want to hear the sermon, you can hear it on that podcast. It's called the Language of God podcast. And I think it's the most recent one. It was just last week that it came out.
Awesome.
It's also in the book, transcribed. And it was, and when I was finished, I was already pulled over. I just started crying uncontrollably. And I knew I was a believer, and I knew that would never change. I mean, that was the Holy Spirit. Those words, some of the words and ideas in there were new to me. I hadn't, maybe they were in my subconscious, but I had never thought of them. And
yeah.
So I mean, how do you deny that?
Right, right. Yeah, that's hard to deny. Yeah.
It's hard to deny. So at that point, I said, I'm a believer. And almost immediately, I mean, really, and that's why I couldn't stop crying for so long. The feeling of transformation was absolutely complete and all encompassing. I just felt, a sense of incredible joy, relief.
Wow.
My body. And I knew what just let go meant.
Yeah, right. That's an amazing story.
All the resistance was gone. Right. So, when people say to me, can you convince me that God is real and that Jesus is who he said he was? I usually say, well, maybe some people can, but I don't think I can. I think God can, I don't know. I know there are people who've been brought to faith through intellectual, arguments, philosophical, scientific, whatever. I almost got there, but not quite. And it took the Holy Spirit to push me across.
Right. So there's that other side as well, that religious experience, that spiritual experience that's important as well. So well, that's great. And, you guys can read about it more in Sy's book. If you just want to hold up your book again one more time.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
It's called The Works of His Hands. The subtitle is A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. It's published by Kriegel, 2019. The foreword, for anyone who's interested in theology, is written by Alistair McGrath. Who's
really?
Very well known.
That's great. Yeah, I'm aware of him. Yeah.
Theologian. So, and you can get it anywhere, bookstores, Amazon, whatever.
Great. Okay, so question 3, Sy. What do you think is the strongest argument for God's existence?
So you mean what I was just talking about, intellectual arguments, right? Yeah. So that's a good question. I think there are several that are strong, not too many, but one I think is the fine tuning of the cosmological constants. I think is a very strong argument because there aren't too many other alternatives for it. The ones that have been proposed are not very solid. One of them is a multiverse, which may or may not be true, but it's not testable. It's no more testable than God is. And another one is, well, we just don't know yet. There may be something that will explain it.
Right.
Okay, that's true, but you can say that about anything.
Yeah, you could say that about anything. Right.
So I think that's a very strong argument. Another one that is closer to my own area is the origin of life. There are some very good, but very technical at this point, reasons to really wonder at the possibility that life began easily through some natural processes. Now, I think that life did begin through a natural process. I've said this many times, because all natural processes come from God. So, every time there's a thunderclap, God doesn't clap his hands. Every time a sparrow falls, God didn't push it. There's the theory of gravity. There's physical laws that do this. So there may be some laws that will explain the origin of life, but we don't know them yet. And so far, progress has been really, really slow and poor, to the point where I'm not alone on this. Many scientists agree, including many atheists or non-theist scientists, agree that we need some kind of a paradigm shift to understand this. And that might include some concepts that have been, prohibited in biology, like teleology, purpose.
Yeah, right.
And other concepts that I think, eventually will be pointers to a deity, just as fine tuning is in physics. So, yeah, I think the origin of life, and that's something that I'm actually involved in terms of research. My last paper, which came out, actually, it's just about to come out.
Oh, cool.
In 2021, is exploring one aspect of that in a mainstream scientific journal. So, there's a lot to do on that, but I think those two are really, really important arguments, and there are other philosophical arguments.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Most of which are way over my head. The problem with being a scientist is that I find philosophy difficult.
Yeah, it is. It certainly is. So Sy, do you think just this notion of the origin of life, the best inference would be that there is a God behind all this, that it just didn't arise out of nothingness or just this random process?
Yeah, I think that's a good inference. I'm not sure that actually does that much for God, because you could say that about almost everything. I mean, I think, since I believe that God created everything, including the laws of nature.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, God also performs miracles in our personal lives, and it's possible that life is a miracle. Every parent. I don't know if you're a parent yet, but
no, not yet.
every parent, when their kid is first born, says, "Oh my God, she's a miracle." I mean, this is universal.
That's
It doesn't
true.
matter what your theology is. So, of course, that's I'm just not being completely serious here, but the fact that it could be that life actually was a miracle, required a direct intervention by the Almighty to do something that at this point we cannot understand how it happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but that's a God of the gaps argument, and that's the first thing atheists will tell me is, just because we don't know it yet doesn't mean we never will. So I'm perfectly willing to wait and see what develops, but I think what will develop, as has happened throughout history, is that the more we learn, and this goes back to your original opening when you were saying about, the glass you look through, and the first thing, whatever that was,
that
the more you drink from the glass, the more, right, eventually you see God at the bottom. I think that was Heisenberg. And I think that's what's going to happen in so many areas of science, and it's happened. I think it's happened a lot in physics. It's not just the fine tuning. It's also, as I said at the beginning, the whole idea of quantum theory and all the uncertainties. And a lot of other physics mysteries that's also, to many physicists, seem insoluble. I've seen totally atheistic physicists talking about the end of physics. The CERN.
Wow.
The CERN did not show the number of particles everyone was expecting, and people don't know what to do next. It's like, where is everything?
Right. And I mean,
dark matter, dark energy, total mysteries.
And you're
now, mysteries don't indicate God, as I said, because that would be God of the gaps. But sometimes when we solve those mysteries, like the uncertainty principle, that's not a mystery. That's a fact. It's a fact that we cannot know two things at once: the momentum and the position of an electron at the same time. We can't know that. Wow. And it's not because we need more research. It's not because someday someone will figure out how to do it. No, it's a fundamental principle of reality as we know it, that we cannot know those two things.
Wow. That's very interesting.
So that could happen in many, but we need to find that. It's not an obvious thing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, just coming back to that idea of, the existence of life or anything at all, right? That still requires an explanation.
Exactly.
The principle of sufficient reason tells us that,
Right.
everything has an explanation, or whatever begins to exist has an explanation. So,
Exactly.
like I said, you can explain
Um,
everything down to the final point in the natural world in the universe, but you're still left with that question that Leibniz
right.
asked: why does anything exist at all? And that
Why
still
is any of
demands
it?
an explanation.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
I think that's what Richard Swinburne said. He's a philosopher of religion. Are you
Right.
familiar
No,
with
I
him?
know. I know. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So he said, imagine there's these ballerinas dancing for eternity. Well, we're still going to wonder why they're even dancing, you know. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so question 4: what is the best argument for Christianity? What would you say?
Yeah. That's I. You know, to me, it's the person of Jesus Christ, obviously.
Hmm.
And if you want, I mean, if you're not a believer yet and you want to know an argument for Christianity, there are many, many, and of course they're not scientific, but they are historical. There is great evidence for the death of Jesus Christ that's been presented by Lee Strobel and Gary Habermas and
Yeah.
many other
Hmm.
apologists. There's no question that Jesus was dead. He didn't survive the cross. He died. And then there's a lot of evidence for the resurrection. I mean, not just from the gospel, but from other sources. Again, I can't quote them now because I don't have it in front of me. But if you read, The Case for Christ by Strobel or any of Habermas's books, Mike Licona, these people have really, they're scholars and they've
They,
done a lot of research. And,
yeah.
and so these are very strong arguments. And, the argument, and the one that's really important to me, because I really love history, actually, and I'm sort of an amateur historian. I don't understand if Jesus Christ had not risen from the dead and shown himself to his apostles and then to the crowd. Okay, it says 500 people saw him. How did Christianity spread so fast,
Mm,
so far away?
that's a good point. Yeah.
And I raised this. An atheist friend of mine said, "Well, you know, Peter," he thought, uh, went around and convinced everyone that this had happened. And I said, Peter never left. I mean, he didn't leave, Palestine until much later, when he went to Rome. He couldn't travel. He was a fisherman. He had no money. Where was he going to go? I mean, Paul went all over the place. He was a Roman citizen. He had money. He knew
Mm.
people. Peter was an ignorant fisherman. He could barely talk. And he wasn't going anywhere. And even if he did, how is he going to convince anyone? Oh, you're talking about another Messiah. There's a Messiah every week here. I mean, that was not the only way that could have happened. And remember, Paul started writing to churches all over Asia,
Hmm.
like 10 years after the resurrection, or even less. So how did that happen? How was there a church in Corinth and Ephesia, etc.? How did these churches get there?
Right.
And the answer is, well, a lot of people saw the risen Christ, and they
Mm.
told their friends, and they told their friends. It wasn't one person. It wasn't even the 12 apostles. It was
Right.
hundreds and hundreds of people.
Yeah. And it's important too, because a lot of people will say, well, maybe it was just like a spiritual type of resurrection, but it seems to be clear that this was bodily. It wasn't
Oh
just
yeah.
spiritual. It's a
Oh yeah.
full body resurrection where they were touching,
Right.
Christ.
I mean, so much happened. The Pentecost story of the arrival of the Holy Spirit, and it just spread. I mean, what I wouldn't give as a historian, as an amateur historian, to spend 15 minutes in Jerusalem at that moment.
Oh yeah, to see what's going
I
on.
mean, that
Yeah,
would be amazing, right?
first hand look.
So
Oh,
yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
I think that's a very. I think other people have mentioned this, but I know other people have talked about the apostles and so many other disciples willing to be martyrs.
Yeah, that's true.
Why would they be willing to do? They had nothing to gain from
Hmm.
starting this new religion.
Right.
It wasn't. I don't want to speak badly about other religions, but there's at least one other religion where somebody started it all by himself, and
Mm.
he had a
Yeah.
lot to gain.
And I mean, Christianity really hinges on the resurrection. I mean, like
Yeah,
Paul says,
absolutely.
if the resurrection didn't happen, your faith is in vain.
No,
It's just
that's right.
it's all
It's based
bullshit,
on that because
So,
anybody. There were a lot of preachers. We know that there were a lot of. Some of the message of Christ was, parts of it was spoken by other people, not all of it, but parts of it. Some of it was absolutely unique. No one else had ever dreamed of those ideas before.
right.
But but the resurrection was unique, and but I mean the miracles too. But miracles. There are other people who did miracles and of various kinds. So I think you're right. The resurrection is key, and I think it happened. I mean, I believe it happened.
Right.
In my soul, I know it happened,
Mhm.
and that's enough. It's sufficient and necessary. So, yeah, that's
Awesome.
why.
Yeah.
That's the best argument for Christianity.
For Christianity. Yeah, it's a great explanation. All right, so we're going to shift a little bit here. Question 5. Can you talk about protein synthesis and how it's
Oh,
required for evolution? I heard you talk about this before, and I just thought it was interesting.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that gets into the details a little bit, but I think it's
Yeah.
worth trying. So, okay. So, and how it's necessary for, what did you say, for evolution?
Yeah, how it's required
Yeah.
for evolution.
Yeah,
Right.
that's what I always say. So here's the story. When you ask somebody, it could be anyone. It can be a theist, an atheist, a believer, scientist. If you say to them, what is evolution? How does it work? They will probably tell you it takes 2 steps. Variation by mutation.
Mm.
Okay, so you have different, this is what Darwin did. He said there are different, every species have, some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, some have more hair, some have less hair. That's variation. And we now know that's caused by mutations in DNA.
And the gene frequency?
No, different genes, new genes coming by mutation.
Mm.
And we know how that works. And that's very well established. The next step is natural selection, because some of those changes in the genes, very few, but a few, will lead to what's called higher fitness. And higher fitness simply means you're better adapted to your environment. Now, that could be, there's no good definition of fitness because it varies all the time. Sometimes it's better to be tall. Sometimes it's better to be short.
Mm.
Sometimes it's better to have a lot of hair. Sometimes it's better to not have hair. It depends on the climate, depends on a lot of things. So some of those genes will, for example, make you, if you're a human, make you taller. If you're an animal, maybe make you have longer hair. And if it gets very cold, the animals with the longer hair do better. And that's called natural selection. But there's something missing in that discussion, which you almost never see. Darwin knew it, but nobody ever brings it up. And that is, you have to be able to pass that new gene on to your offspring. Because if you're talking about selection, if I had a mutation that makes me, I don't know, amazingly strong, or gives me a superpower, okay, I'll be really successful, in life. But when I'm gone, I'm gone. And if I don't pass it down to my kids, there's no natural selection. Right. So if a bird gets better eyesight, I always use that example because, bird eyesight is amazing. And it has to do with genes, and it was natural selection. But if that bird doesn't pass down the gene to its offspring, so what? The bird dies. Who cares?
Right.
So what's required is what Darwin called the strong principle of inheritance. He knew that there was strong inheritance. We now know how that works biologically, biochemically. And the way it works is very, very, very complex, because we know that DNA copies itself. That's fine.
Right.
But that's not enough, because DNA by itself doesn't do anything. What we have to have is the genes. The way the genes work is they allow this, or they start, and very long, complex process that results in the production of proteins. Everything in life is done by proteins. Everything in a cell is a chemical reaction which is catalyzed by an enzyme, which is a protein. So when you get a gene that makes something better, it's because it makes the enzyme better. It makes the enzyme do its job better. So it's the protein synthesis.
Okay.
Now, to get that system going, you need a huge number of proteins already. You already need proteins to be in existence before you can make proteins.
Right.
You already need a lot of other things like various forms of RNA. You need structures like a ribosome. It's extremely complex. I do have a video on my channel talking about it a little bit and showing how it works.
Oh, cool. Okay.
My channel is called Faithful Science, SYENCE. And then most recent video is about how proteins are made and why that's so important. And the reason it's so important is you have to ask yourself, how did that system get started? How do we have the protein synthesis system? How do we have DNA replication? How do we have all these RNAs? How do we have all the other stuff? Well, the obvious answer for anything in biology is it evolved.
Right.
It couldn't have evolved. You need it for evolution.
Right. Okay.
So this, to me, is the main stumbling block in origin of life. You cannot get evolving life until you have already gotten things that are required for evolving life, and we have no idea how they could have begun.
Wow.
They couldn't have evolved.
Right. That's very interesting. Yeah, I definitely want to watch your video to get more.
Okay.
Yeah.
I also, I have another. There are actually two videos. I have. Wait a minute. No. There'll be a video coming out. It's not out yet.
Okay.
I gave a talk at a conference run by Capturing Christianity, Cameron.
Yeah.
And there was a conference in August in Houston. I gave a talk where I talked about this. So that'll be out in a couple of months, I think.
Oh, great. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So question 6, what view of evolution do you hold to?
Yeah, that's a good question because there are different views.
Yeah.
So my views about evolution, as I just said, and often I get into this when I argue with both atheists and with young earth creationists. The thing about evolution is you have to understand what it is not and what it does not do, because some people think it does everything.
Right.
I don't think so. Okay. I just explained why I can't explain the origin of life. I just went through that. I also think, based on science and also my faith, that it cannot really explain human evolution. Now, by that, I don't mean our bodies. I think there's no question that we're primates and that we evolved from other primates, but that's not what makes us human. I mean, physically, we're animals. I mean, we're not much different from any other animal. We're not quite as good as any other animal. But we do stuff they can't do. No other animal comes close to. I talk about this in my book. I kind of have a rant where I talk about all the things that animals can't do. And it's a lot, and so how did that all happen? Well, people say, well, it was evolution. No, it's not, because first, there's several reasons why it can't be evolution. First of all, there wasn't enough time. Humans started around 200,000 years ago. That's snap of the fingers in evolutionary time.
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Second of all, there are no genes that are known to do any of the things like, language, creativity. I mean, we're the same genetically as we were, with a few exceptions, 200,000 years ago. And look at the differences. And all the things that have changed about us, which is everything, including what we're doing now. I mean, when I was a kid, this would have been
right.
inconceivable, in so many ways. But none of that is evolution. That evolution doesn't mean change. Evolution is a biological theory that has to do with genes and alleles and populations and frequencies, and none of that is genetic. It's all cultural evolution. By the way, Richard Dawkins agrees with this.
Mm.
He has said, humans have outgrown biological evolution. We're now in another phase. All of our changes due to cultural evolution, which is our brain.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, right.
And that's why he coined the word meme, because that's the equivalent of a gene, according to him.
Right.
So, evolution doesn't explain humanity in any reasonable sense. And all of these arguments that I often hear is, well, evolutionary psychology has this set of arguments that, well, it was better to help people because then maybe they'll help you back.
Yeah,
So,
right.
This is all storytelling, and some of it is actually funny. It's so bad. So that doesn't work. And of course, evolution says nothing about, the cosmos. I mean, some people think it's an all-encompassing thing. Right. The other thing is, I think that well, I don't think anyone actually says that evolution is impossible, because if you look at young Earth creationists who don't like evolution, but if you look at their model, this is true, for instance, in Genesis, at least, they talk about God creating kinds way above the species level.
Yeah.
And then going on the ark, because they realized everything couldn't fit on the ark. And then after the ark landed, these kinds, quote, evolved, and they use the same concept of evolution that everyone else does. They even have phylogenetic trees showing cats evolving into. So evolution is not really very controversial anymore. It's just a question of how much can it explain.
I feel like a lot of young Earth creationists attack a neo-Darwinism picture of reality. You know what I mean? And evolution theory has changed from Darwinism.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so
we have the extended evolutionary synthesis, which involves a lot more subtlety and a lot more expansion. We have the idea of convergence, which is Simon Conway Morris's work, showing that there are laws in evolution. You keep getting the same things in different lineages.
Right.
You get wings from insects, from mammals, from dinosaurs. I mean, wings occur all over the place. Even fish. Some fish have wings. Wow. So I mean, wings is something, and eyes, and everything else. So this convergence story and some of the niche construction and some of the other new ideas in evolutionary biology really kind of, and not to mention neutral drift and all kinds of new ideas that are really taking over the evolutionary theory.
What about process structuralism? Is that relevant? When did that come about? Is that?
Well, that's very old. That actually started around the time of Darwin with Owen. And one of the leading proponents of that is Michael Denton, who talks about it in his latest book, one of his latest books. I don't know. I know that one because I reviewed it, and it's really not anti-evolution at all. But he thinks that structuralism is important, and I think it's valid, except that we just don't know what those laws are yet.
Right.
But it would be great to find them. That's something I think would be a good exercise for theoretical biologists to try to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So question 7, I have heard you say that you prefer divine design as opposed to intelligent design. I thought that was really interesting. So if you could kind of touch upon that.
Yeah, I guess, and I'm not alone. I've had some feedback from other people who said they agreed with me. I never liked the term intelligent design. I understand why it was used originally, because Paley wanted to distinguish intelligence from non-intelligence, which is perfectly legitimate.
Yeah.
So, if you see a watch, there was an intelligence behind it.
Right. Blind watchmaker.
But what I argue, I think it's in the book, is I say, if you see a watch, it was intelligent. If you see a bridge, there was intelligence. But what if you see a rabbit? We're pretty smart, right? Nobody can make a rabbit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody can make life. So that's way beyond intelligence. And God, and I'm very glad that Steve Meyer has come out with his new title, the return of the God hypothesis,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you know, why the reason ID began talking about, well, we don't know if it's God, it's just an intelligent agent, is because they wanted to get it into the classroom in schools.
Okay.
That didn't work. Let's bring God back. I'm glad Steve Meyer's doing that. That's what we're talking about. And that designer is not just intelligent. That's an insult to God, in my view. You know, he's not a really smart engineer. I mean, I know people in coding who say, well, the DNA is, you know, God was a great coder. Yeah, but, you know, better than you.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So that's why I like divine design, because we don't know how that design works.
Absolutely. And I
we're
think,
not
Sy, I
divine.
think we anthropomorphize
Yeah.
God down to our human knowledge, right?
Yes,
Where
we
there
do.
is this epistemic gap there. We're not
Mhm.
omniscient, you know, so I can see where you're coming from when we're trying to,
Yeah,
you know, we're almost trying to get in God's mind, you know what I mean? And that we can maybe to a
exactly.
certain degree, but like kind of Kant talks about, you can't know the thing in it of itself.
Right. And
Right.
if you
Yeah.
read the Bible, I mean, I did have a stumbling block with the Old Testament. I mean, there were parts of it I read, and I said, this is terrible, or what?
Yeah.
And now, I mean, now I'm teaching Sunday school of all things. So, you know, now when the kids ask,
Yeah.
you know, what does this mean? I say, well, you know, we don't know. We don't know the mind of God.
Right.
Sometimes we have a vague
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. I would agree
But
with
the
that.
idea of reading it literally is just so silly. I mean, you know, I never went through that stage. You know, God actually did this and really did that and told them to do the other thing. And you know, in some cases that may very well be the case, but you know, I'd rather read what the scholars say about it, and then
Oh, absolutely.
you know,
That's what
make
you
up
have to do.
my own judgment based on that, because we don't know.
Yeah.
So
There's a lot to unpack.
there's a lot.
A
It's
whole
a
lot. Yeah.
lifetime's worth, right? And that's
Absolutely.
why, you know, people like Alistair McGrath or N.T. Wright, you know, you can
N.T.
read
Wright's
them,
great.
just
Yeah.
never stop. I mean, William Lane Craig. I mean, there's so many names
So
of
many.
people.
Ed Fazer. Did you ever
Ed
hear Ed?
Feezer, right?
Great book right
Exactly.
here. Yeah.
Yep. Wonderful. And,
Mhm.
you know, that's what they do with their life. I mean, you know, I do science, they do that. And
Yeah.
it's important, because
Absolutely.
I can't do the theology. So
See,
somebody
that's
has
what
to
I'm kind
do
of into,
it.
more like philosophy, theology. I
Philosophy,
love
theology.
science, of course. Science should influence our metaphysics all
Right.
day, you know, but
I think so.
I want to immerse myself more in science as well, because that's
Good.
obviously crucial. So,
All right.
um, all right, Sai. So, question 8: there are many Christians who seem to think evolution and Christianity are not compatible.
Hmm.
What would your response be? We kind of touched upon this a little bit, but maybe if you could unpack it
Yeah.
just a bit.
And I've had those debates. And they basically boil down to what we were just saying, to biblical interpretation.
Yeah.
So you know, when people say, well, you know, the Bible says 6 days, each according to its kind. And you know, it was only 6,000 years, and not enough time for evolution. And then I go back and I say, 6,000 years, where is that written exactly? No. So, you know, everybody interprets the Bible. That's what I also say. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember looking up how it was that, you know, all the children of Adam and Eve had to marry each other. How does that work? And
Right.
AIG had an answer which was so convoluted and so full of various interpretations that I realized everybody interprets the Bible.
That's where it's coming from, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe
So anyway,
misreadings or yeah.
so is it? No, I think it's not at all in conflict with Christianity. I actually think that evolution is like all the other laws of science that we've discovered. It's testament to the power of God.
Mm.
You know, I mean, when Newton discovered the law of gravity, when Faraday and Maxwell discovered the laws of magnetism and electricity, did they say, oh, now we don't need God? On the contrary, these were fervent Christians. You know, both
Yeah.
Maxwell and Boyle as a chemist. I mean, they all discovered laws of nature. And what they were discovering, they knew what they were discovering was how God works, how God creates. Pasteur in biology.
Yeah,
You
you
know,
would never throw God away just because you're discovering
no,
more and
no,
more
what you're
about the
saying is
cosmos and
that's
the
right.
natural
You're
world.
just exactly, you're
Yeah.
discovering the how that God did things.
Eh,
So I think evolution is it's indisputable scientifically. There are a few questions which some people raise, like ID people, which are legitimate questions about how certain things might have evolved, and various. I mean, I can't go into them because they're very complicated. I
Right.
don't even
Yeah.
understand them, but there are quite a few. And they raised one very good question a while ago, which was the issue of irreducible complexity, but that was answered. So, it's good to raise these questions, and I think we'll eventually always get answers. But the basic idea of evolution is undeniable. And in fact, it's undeniable even to people who say they don't like evolution, because microevolution is accepted by everyone, absolutely everyone. I don't know
Yeah.
anyone
Who
who
denies it?
says there's no such thing as microevolution. Even
Right.
Ken Ham, I think, accepts that. So, and microevolution, I have to say, I have an atheist friend. He's very famous, Aaron Ra, who I've
Oh, yeah, I'm
talked to
familiar with it.
several times. He has a fantastic, in addition to his atheism, he is really well versed in phylogenetics, and he has a wonderful video on micro and macro evolution, and it really explains it well. I would recommend that to everyone.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, and I want to touch upon one point, the God of the gaps. You and I talked
Yeah,
about that earlier. A lot of atheists will say theists are committing a God of the gaps, but we're not. We're
right,
arguing abductively to the best
right. The
explanation.
best
Yeah,
explanation,
we're
right?
yeah, the best explanation of all of
That's
contingent
right.
reality.
That's right.
So, I mean, atheists, you could just turn it around on them and say, well, no, you're committing a gap. If when they say, well, we'll just explain it maybe in another hundreds of years.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, if that's not a god, a gap
I
argument,
call
I don't
that
know what
atheism of the gaps.
atheism of the
That
gaps. Yeah,
future science will answer that question. But
right.
as you said, that's a gap.
That's a gap. Yeah, it's a
That's
gap.
not an answer.
And
That
at least, theists are providing an explanation.
right.
Now, an atheist might not like that explanation, but it's still an explanation,
It's an
you know.
explanation.
So,
Right. Yeah, I agree. I absolutely
right.
agree with that.
Okay, let's see here. So question 9, what is the biggest obstacle within the scientific community in terms of accepting the existence of God? I mean, there are a lot of scientists that simply do not. And I mean, you found yourself in that position at one point.
Yeah, I think the number of scientists who would say it's okay. So let me back up a bit. When I was an atheist, I was a firm anti-theist. I not only didn't believe in God, I believed that God does not exist. You'll sometimes hear atheists saying, "Oh, the definition of an atheist is someone who has not been convinced." This is the Matt Dillahunty approach,
Yeah.
and it's nonsense,
Atheism. Yeah.
because it's not that he hasn't been convinced; he'll never be convinced. He's convinced that there's no God, and
Yeah.
I was that way, and I was very clear about it. And then I got to the point where I just wasn't sure I believed, and then I was an agnostic, etc. But the point is that um, the obstacles to faith among scientists who are not absolutely anti-theists, as I had been, or people who just say there's no such thing as God, are not very strong, because most scientists are not that kind of atheist.
Yeah.
I think that that's true. There is data on that from Elaine Uckland. She's done lots of surveys of scientists. And it appears that a considerable fraction, something like, I think, if I'm remembering right, I don't have it in my head perfectly, but I think around 40% of scientists believe in something, okay, other than pure materialism, a higher power,
Yeah.
or
Right.
spirituality or something. So that's not much of an obstacle. I mean, I think in many of their cases, if they had an experience like I had, they would come to Christ.
Right.
And, there are scientists who are Muslim, who are Hindu, Jewish. There are many other religions. Whether they would convert to Christianity is another issue. But the actual atheist, the Lawrence Krauss, Richard Dawkins kind of
Yeah.
atheism, that's atypical among scientists. Most scientists, if you talk about God, they kind of look away. They don't want to talk about it.
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
they're not thinking about it. They're not interested in it. They'd even rather talk about politics than
Right.
that.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
something they're not into it, and they're not going to answer you
I,
really. In privately, they may be thinking about it, but
right.
yeah.
I think a lot of scientists as well, and this just even goes for philosophers who are outside of the field of philosophy of religion, have not really
Right.
engaged with this, robust tradition of
Mm-hmm.
arguments for the existence of God. So, we mentioned that spiritual side, but there's also a huge intellectual side of these
Yes.
arguments, and
Yes.
they just haven't really engaged with that literature.
They haven't.
Yeah.
They haven't, and those arguments have not really filtered down very well.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Philosophy and science have something very unfortunate in common. Both groups tend to be fairly isolated and insulated.
Yeah.
So, when I go to when I went to this conference, which was almost entirely philosophy, everybody knew what everybody else was talking about except me.
I feel like that with the science a little bit at times.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I know how you feel.
Exactly. Yeah. We're worse. I mean, the scientists are worse because there's so much
Right.
jargon. Well, in both cases, there's a lot of jargon. Right. There's a lot of concepts that are not.
Oh, yeah. A lot of jargon in philosophy as well, too. But
Absolutely.
I mean, science is, scientists have all kinds of philosophical presuppositions.
Yes, they do.
Is there really an external world? Yeah. Is there uniformity in nature?
Right.
All kinds of things, So I've heard, people say that, and it really is in a sense that science is a slave to philosophy. I mean, you start with these philosophical presuppositions before you can even begin to do science.
I agree with that, and
yeah.
I've always been one of the perhaps minority of scientists who has a lot of respect for philosophy. I know many scientists, including both, well, not so much Christians, but certainly a lot of atheist scientists really look down on philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's silly and,
yeah,
doesn't lead to anything.
I mean, we can't psychoanalyze these people either. There could be a plethora of other reasons. Maybe just we could take pride for one. Maybe they just don't want to surrender their pride and submit to something. Yeah, right. I think that's it. I think that's pretty common as well. All right. So question 10, is there any specific argument that would make you consider atheism again?
No.
Okay.
That's an easy one.
Yeah.
Well, I've asked myself. I mean, I've argued with myself enough, and nothing.
Yeah.
And I've had discussions with. Oh my goodness, Aaron Rye mentioned Tom Jump.
Pine Creek. Yeah, Tom Jump. Yeah.
Pine Creek Doug. I mean, these are brilliant atheists. And nothing they've ever said. The only way I feel is frustrated that I can't explain to them, better, why they're wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem of evil, one, is kind of concerning for believers. I think it can be.
It happens not to be for me, which is kind of
that's
weird.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I don't know if, I mean, I've talked with my wife about this a lot because for her, that is a big problem. And yeah, she's faith. She's a woman of strong faith, but that is a problem. And I think it's a problem for many people. And I mention it in the book, and I don't have an answer, but what I talk about is something I call the default position. And, is the world good or bad? And in my own case, I thought the world was horrendous. I just had a very bad feeling about the world. About what I found. I sometimes say my problem is the problem of good. I don't know why there's any good in the world. Why should there be?
Right.
Why should there be anything good? I mean, why aren't we simply living 25, 30 years, eating as much as we can, killing anyone who gets in our way, mating with as many women as possible, trying to protect our kids as much as we can, although it's hopeless, and eventually dying. And why aren't we living that way?
That's interesting.
In complete pain and agony all the time. I mean, nothing that we experience now was better in the past.
Right. Yeah.
It was always worse. And, my grandfather, grew up in extreme poverty, almost starved to death as a child. He told me at one point that the first time he ate anything other than a potato was when he was, 15.
Wow.
And, basically walked across Europe, got onto a ship and made it here. And the way we live now to him would be a miracle.
Yeah, that is true.
A miracle.
We take it for granted in a lot of respects.
And the story I tell in the book is about many years ago when I was helping immigrant families, actually from Russia, settle in the town that I lived in. And I don't think I'll tell the story now, but it's in the book, and it brought this home very, very strongly to me. When we complain, about almost anything, whenever I do find myself complaining, maybe Facebook isn't working right, I get all upset.
Wi-Fi connection.
I think about not only where we were, but where I was, when at various times in my life, and then I say, thank God. I say, thank you, Lord, because I have this food to eat, because I have this house to live in.
Right.
And so where did that come from? So yeah, there's evil. I expect there to be evil. Evil is the natural way of the world. I mean, ask a rabbit who's being eaten by a fox. Is that good or evil? It's not good.
Right.
But we experience goodness. And why? How? Where does it come from? It's not evolution.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, and two, on a theistic paradigm, this is going to be, if we live on for eternity after this life, then this is going to be reconciled. But on an atheistic paradigm, you really can't make sense of the problem of evil. It doesn't mean anything at all. It's just this is a really sick game that we're in on an atheistic paradigm.
What I've seen the smarter, more thoughtful atheists say, which I agree with to an extent, is try to live the best life you can and be good to people and hope they'll be good to you, and be whatever. Yeah, I agree. You should be nice. It should be good. But there's a reason Jesus Christ came to us. He's the reason he appeared on earth, God incarnate. He didn't just come by to say hello. He came to tell us how to live. And his message was revolutionary. Historians like Tom Holland and others have written
Dominion.
Everyone has to read that book. I mean, he makes it very clear, before Christ, the whole idea that a slave had any value as a human was meaningless. It never occurred to anyone.
Yeah.
The whole idea of justice, the idea of being fair, of being good, what the atheists are saying we should do. Yes, they're getting it from Jesus Christ. That's who the first person who said these things.
Yeah, I mean, even pre-Christian cultures like the Romans, Greeks, and Persians. I mean, exactly. Just this notion of universal rights or equality, you know what I mean? That was really alien,
unheard of
to these. Yeah. Right. I mean, even some Romans would go down to markets and purchase children for sexual favors and whatnot, and all kinds of stuff like that. So and people don't really think about that, how the world was before Christianity and how Christianity revolutionized the world. Yeah.
I mean, I love it when atheists say, "Oh, the Bible is so terrible. God commanded all these horrible things." Yeah, well, look at the rest of the world. I mean, that's how the world worked. And Jesus Christ came here to tell us how to live. And you can live that way if you don't believe in Jesus, but then you're being somewhat hypocritical because you're mimicking his followers. You're mimicking the people who are following him because they believe in him. So, my view is, it's, atheists have answers. I had answers. One of my answers on this question when I was young, because my parents were communists, that's in the book, was, oh yeah, well, our purpose is to have a revolution and make everybody happy. Well, that was very naive. I outgrew my communism pretty quickly, but there are people who go that way. There are others who have other kinds of political or whatever. So I know people who think that if we all stopped eating animals of any kind and became vegans, life would be wonderful. There are lots of views that different people have, but the one that has worked is the Christian one.
Right, right. Yeah, and we really take our moral values as self-evident. We ignore the historical contingency of these values. So that's a really crucial point. Yeah, I would recommend Holland's book as well. It's so funny because I actually just picked that up yesterday at Barnes and Noble. I've heard about it.
Book, but he writes beautifully. So
right. Yeah. I'm looking forward to reading it. I've heard a lot about it, and a lot of people have been telling me to get it. So I finally did. Yeah. Okay. So question 11, this is the last question. What would your advice be to atheists watching this video right now? And what should they do in order to at least entertain the existence of God?
Okay, so if they were listening to this whole thing, they heard me talk about my dream, and I would just say, just let go.
That's great.
You've got resistance, and don't say you don't. Don't say, no, I just haven't been convinced. Just say there's not enough evidence. Let go of all of that. Open up. God will find you. The Holy Spirit will find you as soon as you're open to hear. In fact, he's finding you right now, and he's giving you signals, but you're not hearing them. You're not addressing them. You're not listening. God will find you. Now, one way to help yourself open up is look at the arguments, the philosophical and the scientific arguments, and don't dismiss them out of hand. Read them and think to yourself, yeah, doesn't convince me that it's true, but it kind of suggests maybe it's not wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And if you can get that far, if you can just say, and I know a couple of atheists who do this, if you can just say, well, I don't really know. I have to be convinced. God should come down and convince me. And yes.
Yeah.
If you're ready, he will.
Yeah, I think I think too, from a Heidegger perspective or an approach to this, a lot of people have forgotten the mystery of being. You know what I mean? They're forgetting to orient their will towards the unknown or towards the infinite wellspring of all there is, God. So there's that component too, where you really have to pay attention to the mystery of being and the experience of being. Right. And then you have that other side to engage with those philosophical arguments, which are really robust, and they can be difficult, but you have to engage with them if you really want to seek truth and you care about the greatest questions that fall upon us.
The great thing about the philosophical arguments is what you just said, is that they don't necessarily point to Jesus Christ. They don't talk about whether the Bible is true or false.
Right.
They don't talk about all these points that are often brought up by atheists, even in their own minds. They're talking about what you just said. They're talking about essential elements of existence.
Exactly.
And when you think about, I'm talking atheists, when you think about those central elements of existence, don't ask whether this was done by Yahweh or by Jesus.
Yeah.
Just ask, is there something more there than I think exists? Is there something more than just, what I think is real? Maybe there is.
Yeah.
And, you don't have to say it's God. You just think about that for a while. Contemplate it. Think about it.
Right. Exactly. And I think we should start with natural theology, classical theism, at least establish that, hey, there is a foundation, a bottom foundation of all reality. And then we could start to unpack the nature of that foundation and what springs forth from that foundation. And then we could get into Christianity and what this God would, why would God even introduce life into the cosmos? I mean, there was a time where there were no thoughts, no minds, no nothing. And then this comes rushing onto the scene. So we could kind of, unpack it further and further, and until we get a whole picture of reality.
Yeah.
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 So, with all that said, Sy, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I really appreciate it. And I hope we can do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, it was great. I had a good time. Thanks.
Awesome.